and welcome back to Politics Relaxed podcast. As you can see, we're here with another interview. We've got Sarah Olney, who's the Member of Parliament for Richmond Park, as well as the Transport, Business, Energy and Industrial spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats. Thank you for joining us here, firstly. But I'd like to start with how do you think the Liberal Democrats are going to rebuild after the 2019 election?
Well, it's nice to be here. Firstly, thank you very much for having me. That's a really good question, and I think it's a question we'll answer quite differently today than how we might have done a year ago. Obviously, this massive, unprecedented pandemic has sort of intervened, and in a way, it's been a very strange year for lots and lots of different reasons. But it's also been a very strange year for politics, because what's happened is that the pandemic and news about the pandemic has really squeezed out every other aspect of political engagement that we might have had. Certainly from my perspective, I found that my job as an MP over the last year has very much been about trying to get answers for local people, trying to understand the impact it's having on their lives. And that's meant that some of the bigger questions, some of the other things that are still going on despite the pandemic, have not had the attention that they might have had. And certainly you see in the media, if you're watching the evening news on the telly or reading any of our online newspapers, the headlines are all about the pandemic. Right now it's all about vaccinations and about travel quarantine and things like this. A month ago it was all about the, frankly terrifying increase in cases we were seeing right across the country. And there's obviously an excellent reason for that. It has a very, very tangible impact on everybody's lives. I see you all there in your bedrooms. You should be at school. And that's obviously the immediate impact it's having, not just on you, but obviously on your parents as well. It's having the same impact here. I don't know what my children are doing right now, but it's quite noisy. So sorry if you can hear them. And so it's very understandable that people are very, very focused on this issue and they want to know what the future holds. And it's really difficult to give people the kind of answers that they're looking for, because everything is so unknown and we've not been in this situation before. So that's really sort of swerved everybody off track. And it's very difficult, I think, not just for the Liberal Democrats, but also for the Labour Party to have a real political impact at this time, because I think the absolute priority is getting to the end of this pandemic. And while we can, as opposition parties, challenge elements of how the government are handling the pandemic, and we have, what we're all shooting for is a time when the pandemic is no longer a political issue, because we want it to be over, we want it to be done with, and we want to get on to talking about other things. So there isn't much political value really in spending a great deal of time talking. It's not going to be a long-term political issue, fingers crossed, the pandemic, whatever we fight the next general election on, it's not going to be on the government's response to the pandemic, because we will all want to put that behind us and we will all want to be talking about other things. But unfortunately, that's all we're talking about right now. So that's, I think, one of the reasons why it's a struggle to have an impact. What I think is emerging from the pandemic and what we will take forward is some of the themes about how the government are handling it. So we've talked a lot over the last year about cronyism, for example, and that comes up not just in the handling of the pandemic, but all sorts of other things. We were talking in Parliament yesterday about the Towns Fund, for example, which has come under a lot of criticism because the housing minister has used it to sort of shovel money to Tory marginals, and he's got a bit of a reputation for doing things that benefit Tories. And the government's just general slowness to act and their inability to really grasp the seriousness of a situation. That, I think, is a theme that will follow this. Both of those are themes that will follow this government around, beyond the pandemic. So for us as a party, it's about seizing some of those themes and using them to demonstrate how, a Liberal Democrat approach to politics is about giving power back to the people. It's about openness of decision making. It's about delegating power down to local authorities. And those are the things, I think those will have more resonance in people's lives after the pandemic. We've seen what a difference strong community engagement can have. We've seen the effectiveness of a local vaccine delivery versus a centrally managed test and trace system, and how much better local authorities and local health teams have delivered the latter. And those are all themes that the Liberal Democrats really want to pursue. I think one of our weaknesses has been a lack of visibility on the national stage. That's partly the pandemic, partly the fact we've only got 11 MPs, but something we And I think the way we get around that is by being much more visible locally, and that's always been one of our strengths, and it's certainly how we've won the seats that we have. We're prevented from doing that. We can't do our door-to-door campaigning at the moment. We can't do our leafleting. We've been actually banned from doing that by the government, which is entirely undemocratic. But that's something that we will really be picking up again once we're able to. As soon as it's safe to do so. And we're certainly very much looking forward to the next round of elections in May. We've just had a confirmation today that those are going ahead, and we will be working very, very hard in those seats where we think we've got a chance of winning to really to make an impact.
That's interesting, yeah. So your party entered a disastrous coalition in 2010 with the Conservatives. Austerity affected millions of people, and some couldn't get enough food and had to start using food banks, and some couldn't get temporary accommodation. Children have borne the brunt of these cuts, and some schools don't have enough funding. Some feel that your party betrayed those voters. How do you, the Liberal Democrats, earn those voters' trust back?
I mean, the coalition was 10 years ago, and we are in a very difficult political position now. And the last 6 years have been a Tory government, not a Liberal Democrat. No Liberal Democrat involvement at all. The manifesto that the Labour Party campaigned on in 2010 was promising similar rates of cuts. So I think any kind of framing of it that cuts happened under the coalition that wouldn't have happened if there'd been a Labour government is false. Frankly, whether the Labour government would have done something differently if they'd won in 2015 or 17 or 19, don't know. But there's certainly not the case that there would have necessarily been a drastically different outcome if Labour had won in 2010. But I think that's to say that's something we kind of need to put behind us, and we need to think about what are the impacts now. And I think you're building a picture there of voters who feel that they've been let down by austerity, but they didn't vote for anything different in 2015. They voted for the same governing party in 2015, 2017, and 2019. So the idea that there's been a wholesale rejection of austerity is not borne out by what voters are actually doing. So we need to listen to voters. We need to understand what their concerns are now, and I think they will be quite different now from where they would have been actually in December 2019, because we're already in a different world from where we were 13 months ago, 14 months ago. But as I think we have a lot to say to voters. We have been the only party that opposed Brexit, that voted against it in the Commons every single time. And I think once the impact of coronavirus, or the immediate impact of coronavirus has passed, we'll start to see how damaging Brexit is threatening to be, not just now, but in the medium and the long term, how much it's going to impact young people's futures. And that's something I think we will continue to campaign very vigorously on. I think the other things that we are committed to as a party, and I think in many ways as important as Brexit, and even more so, is action on climate change. And again, as a partner, you say your framing there of the coalition was that it was a disaster. Now, maybe in political terms it was, but we achieved some very valuable and important things while we were in coalition. And one of those is real action to move this country away from reliance on fossil fuels towards renewables. And that was something so that we have now our electricity generation in this country. We are actually world leading in using renewables to power to provide electricity, and that was something that the Liberal Democrats achieved in coalition, and that is something that we want to build on, that we think this government should be building on, that we think is an absolutely urgent priority for this country, and that's something that we will be putting very clearly to voters at every election that we stand in, and we hope we will get more support from the public, because we are the party that has always championed that particular set of priorities. And I think as well, the emerging issue that we would want to be really taking a stand on is mental health, and such a massive issue. And again, as I say, an emerging issue, because it's going to carry on being an issue beyond this pandemic, and something that, again, we've championed very much in the past. We've wanted parity between physical and mental health. Again, we made quite a bit of progress on this in the coalition, and we need to keep pushing for funding and training and resources to support all our communities as we emerge from the lockdown. And I think this is going to be one of the most fundamental areas that will need support.
Yeah, I totally agree with the mental health point. I think, especially during the pandemic, young people have been affected so much by by lockdowns on their mental health. But I just want to pick up on your point about climate change. I'm really passionate about climate change, and I watched the climate debate in the 2019 election, and Jo Swinson, in her opening remarks, started talking about Brexit, and to me that was a bit worrying because I recognise the huge problems with Brexit, but I think during a climate debate it's important to focus on the climate. And also, do you think your carbon neutral promise of 2045 went far enough?
I think the 2019 rather election was all about Brexit in many ways. And I think the point Jo was probably making there is it's a global problem. We need to be forming alliances across different countries. And that, being a member of transnational bodies helps us to tackle climate change. But there's no doubt that climate change, whether we're in the EU or without the EU, being without it deprives us of some of the tools that we can effectively use for tackling it. And it also lessens the pressure on a government to take action. Because they're not bound to international agreements. But nevertheless, I think the Paris climate treaty is the most important one, and we are still bound by that, whether we're in the EU or not. And I think it's just really important, and I think it is quite encouraging to see that the government themselves are actually moving a little bit more. Boris is making more commitments than any previous Conservative Prime Minister has on this. So it is starting to have an impact. But to me, it's really, really important that we are bound by these international commitments, so that it's not a case that that one can just backslide from those commitments for political expediency. It's kind of like, no, you have agreed you're going to do this, and we have to find a way to achieve it. And it doesn't matter that it might be easier in the short term to do something different. This is a long-term problem, and these are the commitments that you've made. I think with 2045, what we were saying there is we think that that's an achievable target, but it's only an achievable target if we start right now and we do the big things now. And that's got to be about banning petrol and diesel cars. That's got to be about a wholesale switch to renewables for doing our energy. The biggest thing that we have to start doing now is retrofitting our homes to reduce the carbon emissions from home heating and cooking and things like that. And we have to start that now, and we can, only if we start that now will we even have completed it by 2045. It is such a massive investment, and we really, really do need to get on with it. There is much to do in reducing emissions from industry and from agriculture, and those are big infrastructure changes. And we need to find ways of investing in those right now. And our pitch is that if we start doing those right now, we can get 80% of emissions reduced by 2030 to 2035. But then there's the long tail. There's the hard to reach bits. The more difficult, knotty problems. The outliers. And then that's the long tail that takes that final 5 to 10 years to complete. So our pitch is it is absolutely doable by 2045, but we reckon we could be most of the way there in 10 years. And the difficulty with setting targets that might be, 20 to 30 years away is that you remove the urgency of doing things now. That's for a future government to worry about. That's for some other time. And you can see that really in the government's current approach. They're not really grasping the metal. They're not doing the big things. They're not, really their 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution that was released just before Christmas. It's a lot of hand waving. Well, this would be nice to do, or, we should aspire to do that, or, this is the sort of thing that we think would be nice. And it's not, we are going to do X right now, and then we're going to do Y, and that will get us to where we need to go. There's a policy gap, as they say, in terms of what the government has committed to and what's required to get to net zero. And there's still a lot of commitments to be made.
So it's all great talking about reducing emissions, but you have been vocal in that with your opposition of building a third runway at Heathrow Airport. But you also support the building of HS2, which will have many negative environmental impacts. Surely that contradicts your previously stated environmental policy.
No, not at all. And the reason I support HS2 is because what we should, it's a fundamental part to encouraging people to swap from making internal flights. There is really no reason on an island the size of Great Britain why people should need to fly, for example, from London to Manchester, and yet people do. And the reason that they do is because of lack of capacity on our railways. So it's not just about it being a high speed link, it's about there being enough trains running from London to Manchester to make it a viable alternative, or London to Birmingham, to flying. And that's why we support HS2, because in order to meet our net zero carbon, we need to reduce the number of flights. And what we can do about that as a country is to make flying an uneconomic alternative to taking the train. And that's why I support HS2, or indeed taking the car. You know, there's an awful lot of driving between London and Manchester, but or London and Birmingham, but a really good train line and affordable tickets. I mean, that's the biggest barrier to a lot of people. It shouldn't be cheaper to fly, but it is. And that's why I support the building of HS2. I think there's better thing. So far, the implementation has been really poor, and certainly you raise some of the environmental impacts. I think more could be done to mitigate those. But in terms of the long term, getting to net zero, having greater capacity on our railways is absolutely essential.
So Hammersmith Bridge has been closed since April 2019. It affects many people's commute into work and school and into school. So how can you, the MP for Hammersmith and Grant Shapps, resolve this issue and get it open again?
Well, that is an excellent question. All I can say is that some of us are working extremely hard to help make that happen. I have regular conversations with, as you say, the MP for Hammersmith, Andy Slaughter, also Ruth Cadbury for Brentford and Isleworth, and Fleur Anderson for Putney. All our communities are massively impacted by the closure. We are working very hard on a solution, but at the moment, I'm afraid we're getting really ground down. The Department for Transport are not really responding to our calls for a solution. The biggest barrier is the fact that it will cost 160 million to properly fix, which is far in excess of what any other bridge anywhere ever has cost. And that's because it's a grade 2 listed structure. So that, I think, is creating a huge barrier. The responsibility for the bridge lies with Hammersmith and Fulham Council, and there is no way they have that kind of money. And at the moment, we just seem to be stuck in this kind of argy-bargy, for want of a better phrase, between Hammersmith and Fulham Council and the DFT, and it's all political, which is incredibly frustrating. But we just keep going, because what I am extremely concerned about is if I don't get a commitment from the DFT at some stage that they will fund or find some mechanism for funding the repairs to the bridge. I've got a whole community there in North Barnes who rely on being able to access Hammersmith for shopping, for their workplace, their doctors, all sorts of things, and they will be really cut off. And I am constantly trying to impress upon the DFT what the impact of not resolving this problem is going to be on thousands of people. For a lot of people, the impact they see is just increased congestion, which is obviously terrible. But for that particular community in North Barnes, the impact is much more profound. And I am so frustrated that the DFT are not engaging on this issue, and they are not taking the steps they need to take to really help us to sort this out.
With the coronavirus pandemic bringing the travel industry to its knees, and many in the travel sector feeling ignored by the government in the need of the greater good, what pieces of legislation would you and the Liberal Democrats introduce to rebuilding the travel industry during and after the pandemic?
Well, I think the easiest thing would be to rejoin the customs union, the single market, reintroduce freedom of movement, because that would reduce a lot of the barriers that travellers are going to experience when they are back up and running. I mean, I really want to see a focus from the government on supporting our travel industry. And I know, obviously, for reasons we've already covered, I'm not keen to see an expansion in flights, but we're an island nation and we do need a strong aviation industry to maintain those links with the rest of the world. So I would have liked to have seen more help for the aviation industry earlier in this pandemic. But what I really wanted to see is strings attached to that. I want to see a much greater commitment by the aviation industry to achieving these net zero goals that we've talked about, to doing far more to reduce carbon. We've actually passed some legislation this week, which actually will be quite helpful to helping the aviation industry through the pandemic. Fairly technical stuff around slots and so on. And I think we want to see better, more flexible legislation in the future around, which how slots are used at our airports and what links are there. I really want to see aviation, as I said, related to what I was saying about HS2, investing in international routes from our regional airports to really help boost some of our regional economies and to build their links internationally. As I say, I think that's much more important either than expanding Heathrow to give more airport capacity in the southeast where there already is a lot. And in terms of, as I say, international links, just to kind of discourage some of the domestic flights. But I think, again, it's kind of, I think we need time to see how COVID impacts, some of our long-term behaviour. What I do know is there will be a massive demand for holidays next summer, if not this summer. And I think this summer could well be a golden opportunity for the domestic tourist industry. And I really want to see the government support that to the extent as the absolute extent possible. Not least because there will be a lot of industries that will need, opportunity to make up from the losses of last year. But likewise, a lot of opportunities in international travel next year. And again, let's really make sure that we can make the best possible use of that.
So on the 13th of January, in the Richmond and Twickenham Times reported groups of people not social distancing in Richmond. Would you support harsher fines for on COVID rule breakers? And if not, how do we curb COVID? How do we curb?
I really wouldn't. I know what you're asking. I wouldn't, because I don't think that necessarily a fines regime is very effective. It's what we need is for everybody to be conscious of what they're doing all the time. By the time the fine is levied, the infection could have already got round another 5 or 6 people. And it's kind of like what we need to be effective is people not infecting each other. And I think so. What I was pushing for was more signage, and more prompts to remind people. My experience has been that 99% of people want to do the right thing, understand the importance of doing it. They just need to be told and reminded what the right thing to do is. And it is far more important that people keep their distance and wear a mask than it is that people, worry about touching things or whatever. This is an airborne disease, and breathing on somebody can infect them. And that's people just need to remember and to understand. And certainly I'm sure I've been guilty of breaching the 2-meter rule every time I go to the supermarket, but that's because I've been distracted by trying to work out where the cheese is, and not because I'm not thinking about it. So I just need that constant reminder, whether it's from people around me or from signs in the supermarket or whatever it is. And I think that's a much more effective way of getting people to comply with the regulations, because it's not about punishing people for not doing it after they've forgotten, after it's too late. It's reminding them, before they get to the stage where they might infect somebody.
Yeah. We ask every single one of our guests this question. If you could introduce one piece of legislation or a law, what would it be?
Ooh, that's a really interesting one. And I've been asked that several times, and I really should have thought much quicker about a good answer to that. I think right now, the thing I really want to see, I've got a million different things I could say on lots of different aspects, but I think one thing I think would be really effective is anti-idling legislation. In my constituency, we have 6 level crossings. An awful lot of traffic gets caught at level crossing for lots of times of the day, and I just want everyone to turn their engines off, and I think that would make a massive difference to air quality. And the impact of bringing in a piece of legislation, just to refer back to what I was saying before about reminding people, is that kind of like just setting that expectation that when you get to a level crossing gate, turn your engine off. If you know you're going to be stuck in traffic for some time, turn your engine off. More and more cars are, cutting out engines automatically when you're stopped for any. So, and I think that's a really positive thing. But it's just that kind of like, if you know you're going to be waiting for more than half a minute before you can move, turn your engine off, because the impact that will have on air quality. And I know from air quality surveys done across my constituency, air quality is always worse where there's a level crossing. So that would be my small thing, you know. And as I say, just it'd be difficult to police the legislation because, you know, we don't have the kind of resources. But just to bring in that legislation and to make people know that that's now the law, I just think that would have a massive impact on people's behaviour.
Yeah, that seems very admirable. I think yeah, a lot of cars are introducing the anti-idling processes in their cars anyway, so that's a good step forward. But we'll move on to Brexit now. How can a second referendum on Brexit be realistic if the majority of the country still supports it, as can be seen with overwhelming support for the Conservative Party for the 2019 general election?
It wasn't overwhelming support. I think I'm just moving to a different room so I can get my my computer cable. It wasn't overwhelming support. They got about 43% of the vote. And when you're in a general election, you can't say that people voted for one particular policy. There was an awful lot of opposition to Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister, and as many people will have voted for that as you know, voted for the Tories because they wanted Brexit. We're not campaigning for a second referendum anymore. That's gone. That was before we left. And I don't think it's true to say that the majority of people still support Brexit. There's been some interesting polling recently, and consistently, and almost since referendum happened, more people have said that they think Brexit and leaving the European Union was a mistake. And would still support it if we had a referendum now. So I think, in a way, it's not really a question anymore. There's no doubt that there is not the public support for Brexit now that there was in 2016. Second referendum is not a campaign anymore. That was the campaign for before we left. And the campaign was always about having a further vote, a vote on the terms, and actually a discussion about what we might have instead of being members of the European Union, and having a vote as to whether that was what we wanted. And because that hasn't happened, we've had the Conservatives' form of Brexit pretty much imposed upon us, because it certainly wasn't laid out in any great clarity or detail in the 2019 election exactly what they were planning. And I think it remains to be seen whether what the Brexit we have had imposed upon us is what the country actually wants. But the big question is, where do we go from here? Is the campaign now to rejoin? Is the campaign now to enter into some new form of relationship with the European Union? I'm not going to waver in my belief that we were and would have been better off as members of the European Union. And I think that we will want to continue to campaign for that in the long term. But I think, to be honest, our immediate priority is probably around fixing our trading relationship and sorting out some of the issues we're seeing with trading. And so I think a short-term goal would be something around rejoining the customs union, because that will certainly eradicate a lot of the issues we're seeing with it now. But I think, you know, second referendum has gone. And I think, you know, it's kind of like there may well have been support for leaving the European Union because that's what the referendum result in 2016 said. But whether the government has long-term support for its current Brexit trade deal, I think that really remains, European trade deal rather, really remains to be seen.
Yeah.
So can you see a return to the European Union for the United Kingdom in the next 30 years, or do you think it's more likely that we will shift towards closer ties with countries like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand?
There's no reason why both can't happen. But I think in the medium term, as in not immediately in the next couple of years, but likely with a change of government, we will look to have a closer relationship with the European Union. You can't get over geography at the end of the day. The reason that 40% of our exports go to the EU is because it's easy to get them there comparatively. And a lot of our trade is fresh food. And the qualitative difference between getting fresh food to France versus fresh food to Canada or New Zealand is, driving it there on a lorry versus having to ship it there on a container. So there is no doubt that in a lot of sectors and a lot of areas that we're really strong in and want to trade with the world in, getting stuff there quickly is a really, is something that we look for in a trading partner. So I think it's both. And there's nothing to stop us having a good relationship with Canada and New Zealand and everywhere else. I just remain unconvinced that so far what we've seen is that we needed to leave the EU to have these better relationships. By and large, we're now trading on rolled over agreements, as in we have preserved the terms that we had when we were members of the EU with various third parties. And where we have attempted to renegotiate those, we have made marginal difference. And the marginal differences will not make up for the barriers that we've erected between ourselves and the EU. So looked at as purely a trading arrangement, we are not going to win from being outside, at least outside the customs union. We aren't going to make up for that with enhanced trading relationships with the rest of the world. And I think that's a position we need to address quite urgently.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Liz Truss, I think it was a few months ago, was talking about the unfettered access to soy sauce.
Which comes from the Netherlands. So I'm afraid the access to that is very much fettered.
Yeah, exactly.
As indeed is feta cheese, for that matter.
Yeah, just a final question. Would you ever support another coalition with the Tories or Labour, and what circumstances would that be? Because in the run-up to the 2017 election, you recorded support telling Liberal Democrat voters to vote for Labour MPs in seats where Labour candidates stood a better chance of defeating Conservatives. So would you ever support a coalition with either the Labour or the Conservatives?
Yes, I would, but we are talking quite hypothetically. I think my priority right now is I don't want to see a Tory government win another general election, and I think the route to making that happen is that both Labour and Liberal Democrats have to make gains at the next election, and I don't know that it's possible for Labour to win enough seats on their own, especially if Scottish independence has happened by then. I don't know if it's possible for them to win enough on their own to form another government, but I do believe we've both got the opportunity to gain enough seats between us that we could form a coalition. So in terms of an outcome that looks both likely and desirable after the next general election, I'm very much in favour of that. How we achieve that, I think, is a different question. I'm not sure that voters necessarily want to see us doing a formal pact. But also, it's a lot easier for me to say that now than it would have been a couple of years ago, because there's no doubt that there was very little appetite, not just in Richmond Park, but across many, many constituencies for seeing Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister. And that would be something that I personally agreed with. So it's a lot easier to say that now than it would have been, as I say, 18 months ago. And so it's now a more plausible outcome.
Yeah, thank you to Piers and Daniel for helping me interview you, and huge thank you for giving up your time to speak to us. We really appreciate it, and thank you to everyone for watching. Please like and subscribe, and thank you.